Mic not working? Working? Working now. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Bas Simpson. I'm Mainstream Renewables Power Hydrogen Business Manager. We have a fantastic panel with us today, and we're going to talk about how we can effectively scale up Africa's green hydrogen industry with an obvious focus here in the South African Pavilion, given their heavy industry there. So very, very brief background from me before I hand over to our panelists for an introduction. Mainstream Renewable Power is the leading renewable energy developer in South Africa. I think we've got 13 years history there, a number of projects, of course, and we see green hydrogen as not only something that's very exciting, along with the rest of the world, of course, but as a way to bring large volumes of renewable energy to market. So no doubt there's a lot of hype in the industry. So I think today we must try to focus on solutions, trying to cut through some of the froth that's around the place and work out how do we scale an industry that is sustainable and has the right partnerships as we go through. So with that, we'll introduce the panel one by one, and if you can introduce yourselves and a bit of context to your operations. We'll start here with Steve, and Steve, perhaps you can talk to us about why decarbonizing South Africa, Africa in general, through green hydrogen is so important.
Sure. Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Steve Nichols. I recently worked for the National Business Initiative, where I helped to lead the Net Zero Pathways work they did sector by sector, and I'm now with the Presidential Climate Commission, where I lead the work on mitigation and net zero pathway modeling. And so, brief highlight is that as the world moves towards net zero, and we see that more and more, the World Energy Outlook that came out a couple of months ago shows that even under the existing policy scenario, you see a decline in demand for fossil fuels. That's the first time that's ever happened, and we expect that ambition to ratchet up every year and that peak on fossil fuels to move earlier and earlier. And so decarbonizing is something that is happening, and therefore at an individual country level, we have to be thinking about what does our product portfolio look like and how competitive will we be in the future. And South Africa has a pretty dire picture when it comes to that. Our sort of key exports are platinum group metals, coal, ferroalloys, iron and steel, the internal combustion engine. This is not a portfolio that you would choose if you were looking for a competitive economy. So decarbonization is critical to the economy. And from a South African perspective, it's critical to a just transition. This opportunity to radically transition our economy comes with the opportunity to fix some of the structural challenges that face our economy. And so we can fix unemployment, poverty, and inequality. That's kind of the core goal. So to get it close to hydrogen, hydrogen is the most important technology we don't have, right? In all of the net zero modeling work we've done, 70% of the decarbonization can be achieved with the technologies we already have. But hydrogen is a key part of that 30%. Right? We don't yet quite know how to do it. And we need to do it in some pretty important areas. So all of the modeling shows that to get power to net zero, we have to be able to use hydrogen to swap out for gas, for peaking and ramping support. In heavy industry, hydrogen is absolutely necessary for transitioning away from, or at least greening cement, iron and steel. Then in South Africa, we have the particular context of Sasol, which is both a challenge, but also a massive opportunity. And so the role of hydrogen allows the creation of sustainable aviation fuel, which brings us to transport. So hydrogen transport is interesting. I'm personally not convinced about hydrogen in road transport. And I think there's probably a role in heavy vehicle transport on mines and industrial sites, but can't see it happening on road. Would be interested in the panel's view on that. But hydrogen as a bunker fuel and hydrogen in sustainable aviation fuels, I think these are particularly important, and particularly important for South Africa. South Africa is the second most vulnerable nation by trade-weighted distance in the world after Chile. In other words, we're the furthest from all of our markets, right? And so our ability to transport goods and commodities between markets depends on sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable bunker fuel. Our location in the southern tip of Africa is part of the trade routes, and our port capacity is really important. But all those become stranded assets without sustainable bunker fuel. And then, of course, tourism is 10% of our GDP. And so without sustainable aviation fuels, we would anticipate a drop off in tourism, and that's also a big economic impact. So hydrogen, as I say, super important in all of these sectors and how we transition the sort of end of these sectors. And so it's really important that we as a country invest in the pilots. So we're not sure that everything's going to work, right? Some of this might not work, but that's okay because the prize is large. And so to make hydrogen work in the South African context is actually very important in our overall transition. And so these explorations that we're seeing now and that are included in the JETP investment plan are really, really critical to the future of our economy.
Thank you very much, Steve. Mike, we've heard that it's not just a single project approach or even a single industry. We need to build a whole new hydrogen sector. So what is GIZ doing to make sure that this is not just a piecemeal funded approach, but that we actually build a fully supported industry in South Africa?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that question. And first of all, thanks for having us here at this beautiful pavilion of South Africa. It's great being here this afternoon. I represent GIZ, stands for German International Cooperation. We're an agency of the German government for international cooperation. We work in more than 100 countries worldwide with a very long tradition also in South Africa and also in Southern African countries. And we also have a very long, let's say 2-3 decades track record of working on renewables, working with governments, supporting them, advising them, designing policies for the uptake of also new technologies. Used to be PV, wind, others now. Green hydrogen is very big on the agenda. And it has also come very rapidly to us as a challenge to sort of design our advisory programs. We today work on hydrogen in about 30 countries worldwide across the continents, Latin America, Africa, in Asia, but also parts of Europe. And the situation that countries, governments find themselves in when they look into this new nascent opportunity is very, very different. I mean, South Africa has a very, very particular starting point, given the strong industrial base, given the history of coal, being a strong emerging economy with a strong industrial base, with research institutions and everything around. We also have other countries who we are advising that come from a very different starting point. Some are least developed countries, but with very rich renewable resource endowments. So there are great opportunities, but the challenges are completely different. So really trying to understand the different opportunities and strategies in our advisory work is really something that has been keeping us busy over the last 2 to 3 years, when the German government really made that deliberate effort to reach out and to build new hydrogen partnerships. And that's where we're really coming from, working with governments, but also the private sector. And we see ourselves as an enabler, both for making sort of helping market ramp up in partner countries, but also for partnerships with Germany and also with Europe. There's a lot of talk about Team Europe spirit now. So a lot of the work on hydrogen also that we do with countries in Latin America, in Africa, sort of starts from a really European perspective, with both the larger climate agenda in view. So local decarbonization should be really a priority, but also then looking at a possible future of green hydrogen becoming a global commodity. Again, very different strategies that you have to apply in order to address these policy objectives. But that's sort of also something we're trying to better understand and work with partners, work with academia, work with the private sector to really advise governments in choosing the best path and the best strategy and the best way forward.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Timo, continuing the theme of smart Germans funding the world's global hydrogen industry, can you please introduce yourself, H2 Global, and perhaps talk about how H2 Global will approach funding in Africa specifically?
Yes. Well, my name is Timo Boller. I'm the managing director at Hinco, which is an H2 Global. So I hope this works better now. So I'm the MD of Hinco, which I will explain later of what Hinco is. It's the core instrument within the H2 Global funding mechanism. And H2 Global is an innovative approach to scale up the green hydrogen economy. It's a market ramp-up instrument developed initially by the German government. Let's see how things will develop now in the European context. But the idea is really to address that chicken and egg situation that we have at the moment. There is no demand for green hydrogen at the moment because it's far too expensive. There's no regulatory environment that, addresses the need also to buy a green product because the regulatory environment is not there yet. CO2 pricing, border tax mechanisms, quotas, all that is not where it is addressable to buy a product at this price level. Without the demand, there will be no supply. And that is where we want to bring in the business case, the investment case today from a supplier's point of view, but also from an off-taker's point of view. And we do that by providing a physical intermediary between the supply and the demand side. And that physical intermediary, we call it the Hinco, the Hydrogen Intermediary Company. And Hinco wants to provide three things: the price security that is needed by providing long-term offtake agreements, 10 years in this case, a market security by really purchasing with a government-backed offtaker over that 10-year period, and very importantly, thirdly, the regulatory, the legal security, with all the discussions about standards, certifications, regulatory environments. I mean, everybody's following the European context, delegated acts on the RED II. This is all a little bit like in the clouds. Nobody would start investing today. And we provide that investment security by providing price security, market security, and legal security. And we do this on a very competitive-based process. We call it the auction process. So Hinco auctions in a global tender process now for the first auction of 900 million that we're starting, purchasing 3 products for this first auction: methanol, ammonia, and sustainable aviation fuel. Globally, obviously buying it at the lowest possible price. You're also creating pricing signals here. And we're on-selling these products into the European markets, again, in a competitive bidding process. The highest bidder will get the strike, so that we're selling at the highest price that is achievable in the European markets. There will be, at least in the medium term, a significant price gap between the purchase price and the sales price. And that price gap is being bridged by the subsidies provided by the German government, by the 900 million euros. So I always refer to Hinco as the most stupid company in Europe. I'm buying expensive, selling cheap, and ideally I want to get rid of Hinco in 10 years, 12 years down the line when the markets are being established. So it is a little bit like a CFD, a contracts for difference mechanism, but really providing a physical intermediary because there is no reference price. There is no reference price nor on the supply side nor on the demand side. So we're creating these signals, these pricing signals, and also wanting to contribute to a liquid market to be ramped up. Maybe so much in a nutshell what Hinco and H2 Global is doing now for the first auction, 900 million. And there are ample opportunities to develop H2 Global further with additional funding windows, we call them, and there Africa could play a very vital role.
Yeah, thank you, Timo. And look, as a developer, we see H2 Global as the real gold standard for underwriting offtake. We know how important it is, particularly in projects where you have a single pipelines for an offtaker, to have confidence in the long-term viability of that project. Otherwise, the banks are going to laugh you out of the room. So we really appreciate the work you're doing. Kristen, over to you. Tell me how the EIB are catalyzing a new industry.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting the European Investment Bank. We're the EU bank. I'm in the EU, the EIB Global, which covers the operations outside the EU. And we appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think the EIB is probably the only entity out there that is working within Europe. We're working in Latin America, we're working in Asia and in Africa. So we're seeing the trends as this industry is sorry, it's ringing, as it is going forward. The EIB is very proud to be supporting what the South Africa is doing. And it's the visible, we think we should be visible in the support to it. The importance of the JETP, is really trying to catalyze the necessary investment that's needed in South Africa. You're going to see that there needs to be a commensurate amount of investment to the needs. And with the 8.5 billion, our 1 billion, we're trying to help in our ways. The leadership on the path to success is when you're going through this transition is something that we need to make sure that it is also something that is addressing unemployment, poverty, and inequality. So I just want to highlight that these aspects are quite important to be taken on board in this transition. Now, this panel, the question is, how can we scale up Africa's green hydrogen industry? And if you're just going to write down one word for EIB, it's partnerships, it's together. And I'm very happy to have GIZ on the panel, because in Latin America, we work hand in hand with you. And in the case of Chile, we're working on the Team Europe initiative related to scaling up green hydrogen in Chile. So it's together. I mean, the EIB, the Climate Bank, we are working in many different areas. So I think we need to think about this. I work in the public sector. I have my colleague here, Michael, who is the corporate. It's going to be multi-sector involvement in trying to bring this agenda forward. We can't just think about it as from a project or development point of view. You need the infrastructure in place. You need the education to have the staffing. It's a very complex process. So anyway, we're very happy to support and work together to help South Africa find the solutions.
Great, thank you, Krishna. I think that point on partnerships rings true throughout the value chain, right? So as a renewable energy developer, if we're working with new off-takers for us, not grid, but industrial players, we can have the best wind and solar in the world and a combined capacity factor of 60%. You can't run a Haber-Bosch facility on 60% or a green DRI facility or a Fischer-Tropsch process, right? So you need integrated partnerships, not just in the sources of funding and support, but across the value chain. I think it's a really key point that you bring up there. Masorpa, thank you very much for your talk yesterday. I was saying before, I saw an article in Bloomberg this morning. You've got key stakeholders here reflecting the interest in South Africa as well. How do you and the presidency take a lens and focus all of this energy and support into real targets that we can achieve in South Africa?
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation to be on the panel. For those that I don't know and haven't met yet, my name is Masorpa Moshweshwe, and I am the Green Economy Specialist in the Investment and Infrastructure Office in the Presidency. I'm also the Chief Director for Investment Promotion in Infrastructure South Africa. So a couple of things. I think we're seeing sort of significant interest in and progress in green hydrogen projects. We see sort of significant amounts of aggregate demand from potential demand centers like Europe and the Far East. Much of this investment will be led by the private sector. So really the role of government in terms of this is to create an enabling environment for that investment to flow. There are a number of sort of important market signals that government has put out. The first one is from a policy perspective. We have a draft country investment strategy that went out for public comment in May of this year. It identifies a number of investment focus areas in terms of existing industries, but also importantly, points to 5 nascent sectors that we feel from an investment perspective could be paradigm shifting. And one of those is green hydrogen. It also speaks well to 2 others of these big 5 frontiers from a nascent industry perspective. The other one is ESG and impact investing. I think it is important as we sort of compete on the global stage for the limited amount of early stage premium demand that exists. We understand that we are competing with other regions in other parts of the world. We have the sort of resources, yes, we have the sort of understanding and skill to develop large-scale industrial projects. And we have access to technologies through technology partners and others, but to bring that together requires an element of funding, and you need sort of that funding to come in a manner which is relatively concessionary at the beginning. So it is important to be able to package these projects such that they speak to the fundamentals of ESG investing. The other one is we see sort of the opportunity for an ecosystem approach. It's not really only about the sort of green hydrogen projects themselves, whether we're sort of talking in battery limits or out, but it's also the supporting industries. The scale of what we're talking about is enormous, so there's opportunities to foster local production of components and others, not in a manner which is driven, let's say, by a government policy to impose it on industry, but because you have the scale and you want to co-locate close to the source of demand for your product, or in the case of things like PGMs, close to the source of excavation and preparation of those minerals. So for us, really, we see an ecosystem approach to this. It is important from a government perspective to also sort of highlight that we don't only see green hydrogen as a commodity for export, though we do see exports leading. As Timo has said, there is the significant price differential between green and gray hydrogen. Obviously, their contract for difference is really a market maker and an important element. But ultimately, we see sort of exports leading, and from that perspective, we have the ambition to develop sort of 3 to 6 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2030. We have a pipeline of projects that can do it, and that is to demonstrate in practical terms what it is possible for the country to do, to be able to be a cost competitive, reliable supplier to international markets, and to build that knowledge and trust with our trading partners. So we also see from the ecosystem side, the role of SEZs, our special economic zones, playing a role sort of close to the points of export, creating a nurturing environment for sort of other companies to crowd in. And I think from that perspective, our commercialization strategy, which has been prepared by our Department of Trade and Industry, and should hopefully be out by the end of this month, articulates in sort of very clear terms how we see green hydrogen as a vector for marrying our mineral endowment with our renewable energy endowment to drive first stage beneficiation and industrialization in the country.
Great, thank you, Masopa. So at this point, I'd invite any panelists, just put your hand up, we'll get the microphone and we'll have a conversation here. And maybe to start off, Steve, I'll ask you. We've mentioned a number of industries here, and what makes South Africa so interesting is the volume and the intensity of the heavy industry that could use hydrogen. How do we rank these applications and really focus on the most viable, the low-hanging fruit over the next decade to make sure we're not wasting the time and effort of key stakeholders here on the panel on applications that might not be so immediately attractive? Road transport you mentioned before.
Yeah, so I mean, I you know, that's a question I have for the panel. I think I'm going to take over your job. But I guess in our minds, the things that are sort of future opportunities, hydrogen for power generation, we don't see that happening until the mid to late 2040s, although you want to run some pilots now, proof of concepts. I think the immediate opportunities are much more likely in heavy industry, and you know, transitioning the chemical sector and the role of Sasol, I think in that is a really important question. And then iron and steel. And I guess the commercialization model, I guess we'll learn more when the commercialization strategy comes out, is really interesting. The work that we've done suggests that the sort of break-even weighted average cost of capital is 5.5%, which is really low. The private sector aren't going to be able to raise that kind of funding on their own, and therefore need that support of the state and the enabling environment. We imagine, and be interesting to hear your perspective on that, we imagine that there is a commercialization model driven on European demand as opposed to local demand. It's far too expensive in the South African context to really get hold. And so you're going to build this infrastructure and learn these lessons and build the skills on the back of beneficiated iron and steel export to Europe. And so, you know, it would be interesting to hear how those kinds of things are coming together. From our perspective, it's really early stage. It's still very much a theoretical framing for how things need to be done. It'd be great to hear more about what's actually happening on the ground. But those would be how I understand the priorities. I'd be really interested to hear if people differ with that.
I fully agree with your list of priorities, and maybe just like to add to them. Certainly, the ammonia production for fertilizer is a big subject, especially in countries that are heavily import dependent, and given the impact of the Russian war against Ukraine and what we see on the global food markets. And also the price difference, the cost difference is probably one of the earliest applications that will allow a somewhat competitive usage of green hydrogen. Also, international shipping we see as an interesting sector. Sustainable aviation fuels, a couple of interesting developments around those sectors. So they could also be drivers for the market. Premium markets, maybe also of consumers that are willing to pay that extra buck on the ticket price of a ticket. I also see for the heavy industries that you mentioned an important role for public procurement as a demand from the demand perspective, and that's also something that is currently discussed under the concept of the Climate Club that Germany, among others, are trying to promote under the G7 framework to come to some form of an agreement or a quota where governments, especially in the industrialized countries, should aim towards quotas in buying green steel, green cement. I think these could also be very important drivers for the market.
Great. Mike, you mentioned sustainable aviation fuels, and of course, Sasol is an enormous player in South Africa, but the Fischer-Tropsch process, as we know, requires some carbon. So how does that introduce complexities from sources of European funding, when, of course, right now we don't have easy access to zero carbon, of course, or zero emissions, zero CO2 carbon. So how do we approach that when we're talking about Sasol's 2.3 million tons of hydrogen currently used for sustainable aviation fuels?
I know I'm dressed in blue today, but it's I'm not representing Sasol on the panel. Maybe a couple of things. The first one is in terms of your previous question, it is worth sort of taking a bit of a look back on sort of where green hydrogen comes from a South African context. So we have a long history in terms of looking at green hydrogen. Our Department of Science and Innovation has been leading work on this for the last 15 years. It's been primarily focused on mobility, supported by the Platinum Group metal sector. I mean, between ourselves and Zimbabwe, we hold 90% of known PGM reserves. So naturally, as we sort of look forward and the move away from the internal combustion engine to battery EVs and others, it poses a demand side risk for that sector. About 30 to 40% of the material goes into the supply of catalytic converters. So a lot of work has been done on that element around heavy trucks and mobility. Do we see sort of potential there? I think so. I would agree with Steve that it's not in the retail or sort of passenger sector. That element in terms of sort of battery EVs over the last decade, last 15 years, has made immense strides. But I think the elements related to sort of heavy trucks, heavy haulage trucks, the mining sector and their dump trucks, there's still potential there. We do have a demonstrable project in that sense, the Anglo truck in Mogalakwena and their view on sort of decarbonizing their operations by moving from these diesel-powered dump trucks to fuel cell powered ones, provides an example for that sector. I think one of the other panelists spoke about maritime. Maritime is an interesting one because it is also an opportunity to attract traffic back to our shores and what that offers in terms of a resuscitation of that sector. We do though see sort of methanol sort of leading. We do have some unavoidable carbon sources. But ultimately, as that sector transitions, and their assets are in use for sort of long periods of time, so it's not a quick switch over to move their sort of fleets to cleaner technologies. We'll see sort of ammonia-powered elements in the medium to longer term. The other one in terms of aviation is an interesting one because there is an enabler that's required from sources of demand, like elements like book and claim would be a major enabler of that sector. You're not looking to sort of produce sustainable aviation fuel, send it to Europe and other places for them to use. If those credits can be sort of counted in a South African context, there's a significant opportunity. We do have access to bio sources of carbon. Will they be enough? Probably not, but sort of in a related sector, we are a water scarce country. We are projected by 2030 to have a 17% water deficit. And we have sort of massive amounts of alien invasive species and programs that the likes of DFFE and others run in terms of clearing alien invasives in a labor-intensive way that could be ramped up to provide a dual benefit, an element of sort of biocarbon, while in a very sort of tangible and realistic way, providing employment opportunities for unskilled sort of workers. I do go back sort of to the initial one, sort of we do see exports leading. We see sort of the production. Most of these large scale, gigawatt scale projects will produce ammonia for the export market. We do see territories like Japan looking at co-firing ammonia in their coal-fired power stations as a way of reducing emission, aiming for targets of up to 50 and 60% of co-firing, which would be a major source of demand. Like Steve, I don't see that, let's say, playing out in the South African market in the short term. But I think there's multiple areas of potential and sort of we see different projects coming out looking to address different parts of that market. Obviously, an exciting announcement was made about 3 weeks ago at the Africa Energy Week around an MOA between Sasol and ArcelorMittal around the resuscitation of a mothballed steel mill that exists at Saldanha Bay. So that's adjacent to an SEZ. It's at a deep water harbor. It has DRI technology, and therefore has the potential to start producing green steel with little sort of capital upgrade. And that is a sort of real and tangible project when most people say, what is this green hydrogen discussion and how does it affect me potentially? It's something that is, people can kick, feel, and touch. around what we mean when we talk about the reindustrialization of the economy off of the back of elements like green hydrogen. I'm not avoiding the Sasol question. I'll get to it now.
It wasn't an easy one. That's fine.
So as many of you know, one of our flagship projects is the Boegoebaai, well, now it's called Boegoeberg-Sibaya green hydrogen project. It's a long-standing project of the Northern Cape. It's been sort of under conceptualization by the province for more than 20 years. And when we assessed it as Infrastructure South Africa, our assessment was that it had significant potential. The province had invested probably around $6 or $7 million at that point in pre-feasibility studies and other elements, but we felt that the business case needed further development. And as sort of this element around the new wave and opportunities around green hydrogen presented themselves, we saw the opportunity to sort of bring in an additional commodity, bring in a point of generation of green hydrogen close to a point of export, and something that could support a greenfield port development. And we chose Sasol to be our partner in terms of that for two reasons. One, obviously, they have a significant industrial base and knowledge around fish and chop, like you mentioned. You know, they produce 2.4 million tons of gray hydrogen a year. So it is not taking a punt or a bet on somebody who doesn't have the significant knowledge and skill on building mass industrial infrastructure. All right. The other reason we chose them was because their transition to green is existential. Unlike many companies, and we'll talk about green hydrogen, it's a nice to do. If Sasol doesn't transform, in a few decades time, it will not exist. So hence the focus and importance of that kind of conversation. And in many ways, you'll sort of hear them speak with a much more clarity around what green hydrogen means to them than many other industries or many other sectors. But from our perspective, when we talk about a just transition, if Sasol was to close down, the town of Secunda is dead. You know, if Sasol was to close down, the town of Sasolburg is dead. So those kind of sort of very real and tangible implications of how to extend and transition existing infrastructure from fossil fuel based to green is an important part of this discussion for us. And an important one around how you don't abandon existing and embedded infrastructure as you transition to green. I know that was like the longest answer ever in the history of a panel, but
That's the problem, Ms. Orbit. If the topic wasn't so interesting, we wouldn't talk about it all the time, right? Which I'm sure our families are probably aware of. Timo, Kristen, I want to come to you both. It feels like a strange question to ask when an industry doesn't really exist yet. But what lessons have you learned over the last 18 months from being involved in green hydrogen that we can apply to scaling up Africa?
Okay. Well, I think that, you know, it was mentioned, you know, 20 years pre-feasibility studies. If you look at just the process of any project, you need to invest in the pre-feasibility studies, the feasibility studies, and then scaling up and the proof of concept. And this is something the European Investment Bank, with enabling technologies, with the NER 300, we were, you know, trying to proof of concept. You know, people thought maybe we were a bit crazy when we were off in the offshore wind, way back when. Now people think that this is normal, but as a public bank, I think it's important to help try to structure the risk so that the different parties can take about. So I think the one lesson, going back to my point about partnership, it's working together, it's listening, it's trying to understand what are the needs, what are the risks that one can take. Often having a grant instead in a first loss piece can help crowd in different types of investors. With the EIB supporting these new technologies, we have worked together in partnerships to create funds to help fund these areas. But it's the ecosystem that's going to be created. And I think that is the point of the communication and with the communities to see that the jobs are going to be created. And, you know, you mentioned water, which is something very dear to my heart. Water is life, and we know we cannot underestimate, you know, the importance of trying to deal with that issue when you're talking about the green hydrogen. The EIB launched a study last week. And I think there, you know, you see the real potential that is there. So the biggest lesson is listen, and then, you know, to work together to try to find solutions. Mistakes will be made. This is sort of the learning process. And that this is something that is being developed across the continents. It's something that, you know, in Europe, you know, we have the engineers at the EIB, the economists at the EIB, that if anyone who's ever gone through a project evaluated by the EIB know they dig quite deep and ask lots of questions, which can also provide a certain comfort to know that, you know, we are looking at all the different elements, including the environmental and social, which I think is something that we cannot forget.
What have we learned over the last 2 months or 2 years, actually, since we started H2 Global? I think there is an extreme excitement at the moment. Everybody looks at that opportunity. The industry is ready. They want to change. They want to invest now. Everything is set to start, but we see MOUs being signed more or less every day. Everybody thinks, okay, the economy is there, but it's MOUs, it's not FID. And we need to bridge that gap. Very simple example. I was in Australia a couple of months ago. Every morning, we were presented with giga scale projects that Australia plans. And then after 4 days of these giga projects that were presented, we were taken to the largest electrolyzer that is installed at this point in time in the Southern Hemisphere, not only in Australia and the Southern Hemisphere. It was 3 megawatts. And that is the reality. So if we want to get from 3 megawatts to 30 gigawatts, that is the bridge we need to take. And we need to create that investment security that we have. And the other question is also that we talked early on about, where is Africa coming from? Every day I get calls from traders, from journalists. Where are you going to source from? And what is the price? Who's going to be the cheapest? Honestly, we don't know. But there is Africa point of view that other parts of the world have similar good conditions when it comes to the, let's say, you know, production costs in regards to solar and wind. Australia, the Middle East, for example. But they have comparative advantages, lower cost of capital, political security. If you take all that into consideration, it's going to be very interesting also for us to see where will Latin America, emerging markets, Africa, compare to these more developed markets. And that's where, Masopo, we talked this morning about maybe taking an Africa window under H2 Global, where we could maybe use specific instruments to allow emerging markets, Africa, Latin America, to sort of create those markets, not directly maybe in competition with other markets like Australia, like the Middle East. And that is instruments where we should try to bring things together, CapEx funding to create the right logistical facilities, to have those infrastructure in place in Africa, and then other instruments like H2 Global to create also the offtake. And then I think we have a huge opportunity for Africa to become a really virtual exporter, but also consumer of green hydrogen and its derivatives.
Thank you very much, Timo. We have 10 minutes, a hard stop at 25 past. I want to open to the audience here and see if there are any questions for our panelists today.
Steve, question for you wearing your PCC hat. Could you, JETRP's catalytic in many ways, just elaborate on what's been earmarked in the investment plan for green hydrogen? See, scrolling back, you probably mentioned this many times in your panels, but I'd just be curious. I haven't heard it yet, and just some of the detail there.
Yeah, I'm not able to provide too much detail, but you know, the the intention of the investment plan is important. So the goal is to start to build the infrastructure that you need around hydrogen. So there's a huge focus on things like, they use phrase like incubating the green hydrogen ecosystem. And what that involves is building the planning capacity. So making sure that government at the various spheres are able to interact with the hydrogen planning process. It talks about doing feasibility and proof of concept studies. And so there's a whole range of concept studies across a whole range of sectors, including industrial sectors, including fertilizer, including road transport, really starting to try to test out which is feasible, which is not, try to start working out what does this investment sequence look like. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of investment around skills development, particularly in the hydrogen space. And that fits in with the broader investment plan, which has capital allocated for the broader skills development framework within the country, and in particular a focus on municipal skills. And so there are a whole bunch of things that we have to think about, and again, to assert the facilitator role once more, I have some key questions around the just transition components of hydrogen finance. So we're already looking at a commodity that there isn't a hugely competitive market. It's relatively loss-making. And then we still have to start to factor in these just transition costs. How do we finance hydrogen in a way that is also transferring ownership to poor communities that don't have any kind of risk-bearing capability? How do we start to do the training of communities and the distributive impacts of communities? And that kind of concerns me. And how does that change the financial model? So I'd be interested in maybe some of the other panelists' views on that, if it's okay. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe just one aspect I'd like to add to your line of thinking is on the just transition. I think what is so fascinating about this new technology and the potential that comes with it is that I'm looking at a poster here on the just transition. It's not, I mean, we started the just transition debate about the cost of the transition. How do we manage social costs, especially with phasing out coal and other fossil resources? I think the green hydrogen element really challenges us to talk about benefit sharing. I mean, where will the revenues come from? Where will the benefits be, both in terms economically, but also socially? That's why I like your ecosystem approach so much, but to really try to maximize on benefit sharing in this. Because, I mean, if we're serious about deep decarbonization, we will have a huge global market for this product in 10, 20 years time. But who will reap the benefits? And because it's especially, you know, the fact that we need huge areas of land. No, it will be very, very land intensive, this technology, given that the power is supposed to come from wind and solar. And so who owns this land? How do we avoid the ripping off of people and things that we've seen for food production in parts of the world? And I think it's complex. It makes even, or probably adds a level of complexity to what seemingly is only a technological and economical challenge. But I think it is important with regard to making that transition socially acceptable in different parts of the world under very different circumstances. But that type of cost sharing, but also benefit sharing of that transition, I think really plays out well in the sector for green hydrogen.
Yeah, I'm going to keep that question going and hand to the other panelists. How do we ensure a just transition?
I've learned a new trick today. You can be like Steve and then not answer questions, but ask the rest of the panel and be a deputy facilitator. So well played, Steve. I do think if one looks at the South African picture, it shows sort of why, if we, let's say, take an extended approach and not just apply the financial matrix, there's a deep case for investment in hydrogen in South Africa. So yes, the JETP and other instruments point to the need for us to decarbonize our electricity generation. That is a given. It points to sort of other elements like EVs and the opportunities around hydrogen. But South Africa industry has a deep embedded history and use of fossil fuels. So on elements other than electricity generation, hydrogen has the potential to decarbonize about 10 to 15% of South Africans' existing carbon footprint. So the ability for us to generate large-scale projects, to go through that learning curve, to prove ourselves within this based on the export market, has opportunities for the decarbonization of a very fossil fuel intensive economy, you know? So why South Africa and not another sort of a territory that has a much higher use of renewables, is it gives us a deep an embedded opportunity to decarbonize ourselves. So it's not just about producing a product for the decarbonization of export markets, but in a very real sense allows us to decarbonize some of our existing industries and brings in new opportunities, you know. So is there a way to find an opportunity for mutual benefit on large-scale industries like steel? Can we do some element of first-stage beneficiation and then have finished product development in Europe and other developed countries, such that you assist some of those existing heavy industries that also need to decarbonize in developed economies without necessarily saying, move operations completely from Europe to close to the point of mineral extraction, but some element of dual benefit, you know, can be achieved by both territories, are some of the nuanced elements, you know. So the model around the evaluation, I hope, starts to bring those kind of elements in. You know, yes, we get a product for X price from such and such a territory, but what does it mean for, you know, the decarbonization of our economy and that of the supply country, I think is an important element to be considered. Timo mentioned that we did have the opportunity this morning to engage with the minister from BMZ and the state secretary from BMWK. And one of the things that we were talking about was this specific Africa or sub-Saharan Africa window on H2 Global. Because all of this, you know, even very advanced projects are not going to be banked on aggregate demand. It's going to be on the strength of the PPA. So our job really has to be enabling these to be able to secure elements of offtake. And as we consistently say, mechanisms like H2 Global are market makers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Orper. And yeah, I think the challenge has been set, right? We need to go from a 3 megawatt electrolyzer to hundreds of gigawatts by 2030 in a macro environment facing considerable headwinds. You know, we're seeing renewable energy costs go up for the first time in many years. Electrolyzer costs are not coming down to the speed that people are hoping for. Right, so I think the challenge is really here for that panel, and I really appreciate all of your input into today. And we must do it in a just way, of course. So with that, I'd ask each panelist whether they have a closing statement, if they can possibly keep it brief, and then we'll wrap up the conversation today.
So, I mean, my closing statement would be, there's a lot of complexity that we've talked about here, but just to remind, it's what I said at the beginning, there are no credible net zero decarbonization pathways that don't have hydrogen in them. And so we have to find a way to make these work, and the JET-P offers us the opportunity to explore those early opportunities.
Yeah, I guess it is important to really look forward and try to imagine the world in 2030, 2035 under a deep decarbonization scenario, and to imagine the markets and to draw, let's say, instruments and market signals from that outlook. Because if you just look at the sort of, you know, you mentioned the electrolyzer capacity in the Southern Hemisphere, that's pretty frustrating and discouraging. But if you look ahead and you try to do some foresight and try then also to engage governments, as I said, for example, through public procurement, to send those signals that sort of pioneer the steps that we have to take anyway in order to get to the Paris target. I think that type of imagining the future is an important element in creating also that market beyond the more, let's say, technical nitty-gritty bits that need to be done that are also huge challenges.
Maybe from my side, just like a personal wish. I spent a lot of time in South Africa, and I counted together, I think over the last 30 years, I flew more than 100 times, mostly with South African Airways, from Germany to South Africa. And I hope within the next 5 years, I will enter one of those planes and the pilot will, make the announcement, guys, today we are flying carbon free with eSAF that is being produced in South Africa or Germany, wherever. And once we've reached that, and I think that can be doable within the next decade, I think we need those steps, and I want to reach that point where we're flying carbon free.
If you don't remember from the beginning, partnership, working together. So that is, that I would like you to remember. And also, we've been talking a lot about, we had this study that they thought that 50 million tons per year of green hydrogen could be, there's the potential there in Africa by 2035. But it's about jobs. It's about an opportunity to transform and develop economies. And I don't think that this should be lost in the discussion. It's about clean water. It's about sustainable energy and increasing the competitiveness. So I think that we need to look at it maybe from a business perspective. You're just looking at it from your corner of the world, but from the whole ecosystem and the importance in the South African economy, I think we need to keep the developmental aspect in check.
I don't think we should lose focus on the fact that in 2020, there was something like 350 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity in the world. Late last year, the quantum of announced projects was somewhere around 89 gigawatts. So there's also significant value chain opportunities to be captured. Most of these large scale projects, it's not about the price of electrolyzers, though that is some element that needs to come down over time. It's the ability to secure supply for your project within the next 3 or 4 years. So some of the elements that we need to focus on from a country perspective is those value chain elements. We are home to 90% of PGMs. Are we focusing significantly on attracting electrolyzer OEMs to establish a base in South Africa such that we build that capacity close to the source of the mineral extraction, but also so close to the point of demand in South Africa and on the rest of the continent. And then my last point is there's an announcement that will be held at the Africa Pavilion at 5:30 today for those that are available, that will talk to some targets around Africa's production capacity in green hydrogen by 2030 and beyond. And I think we should sort of keep focus on the fact that there is significant collaboration opportunities in the region and on the rest of the continent. And those kind of announcements are ones that we should support and not necessarily see as competition. Thanks.
Yeah, it's 5 minutes. Oh, of course. Yeah, one photo and then. Don't run away, Jesse.
really looking forward to today's discussion, particularly because it's very topical in South Africa to be thinking about emerging energy narratives. Sorry. All right, thank you, everyone. So, I mean, I think if you're an energy planner in this day and age, you're really in a tough spot, right? You're caught between this world of a lot of moral pressure on planning net zero systems, and then perspectives on real world transitions that differ, right? And you hear narratives like, well, the world's not moving as fast. We're actually on target for a 3-degree world, and that might actually change how you perceive the energy system and energy planning. And the gap between the ambition that we have and the what we actually see is quite large. And Tim from the International Energy Agency will talk about that a little bit, that we see in the differences in their scenarios. And so on the one hand, you've got the net zero advocates saying that if we don't make this transition, we'll be trade exposed, we'll exacerbate impacts on the poor. And on the other hand, you've got people saying, well, if the world doesn't move as fast and we move too fast, we'll have an electricity system that's more expensive than our competitors, and therefore we won't be competitive, and therefore we'll have different kinds of impacts on the poor. And so these are kind of the polar opposite worlds that we live in, and navigating that as an energy planner is incredibly complicated. And so today we're going to discuss these issues and try to get to the bottom of it. What's really happening in markets? How fast are things moving? How big is this gap really? And so we're fortunate enough to have two people to frame the conversation. We've got the World Bank, Erwin de Nys, who actually used to work in the South Africa office, so knows our context quite well, talking about the climate change development reports, country level development reports that they have been doing, was focused specifically on South Africa and really frame for us what that net zero pathway looks like. Then we've got Mr. Tim Gould, who's the chief economist from the International Energy Agency, the energy economist from the International Energy Agency, who's going to reflect a little bit on the World Energy Outlook and the coal report that they launched today, right, earlier today, looking at some of these components around the future of fossil fuels and the energy mix and this gap between existing policy and what we hope to achieve. And then we've got a panel of South Africans who are going to kind of consider this input, what's really happening in South Africa. So we've got Andre de Ruyter, who's the CEO of Eskom and really central to these planning decisions, and really interested to hear what he'll have to say. Joanne Yarwich, who has been working on the JET investment plan and has to have also been thinking about these complexities. Then we have Klingiwe Rendebe, who's an energy specialist, but also representing the youth here. Who will give us hopefully a perspective about, well, you know, there's a moral imperative here. And then we've got James Mackay, who's the recently appointed CEO of the South African Energy Council, and also has to kind of think about crowding in all of the different energy interests into a single South African plan. So that's the goal for today. We want to keep it quite choppy and rapid, so happy for people to ask questions from the audience, and we're going to hopefully have some good interactions with the panel. So I'm going to ask Erwin to come up first and just kind of talk us through what's happening in the CCGR in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Erwin de Nys, and I will be making this presentation on behalf of our chief economist of the Climate Change Group, Stefan Hallegatt, but really behind this country climate and development report for South Africa is a whole large team of which several of the members are connected online, Mariano and Jack. And it was also done through a lot of consultation within South Africa, including building on the platforms of the Presidential Climate Commission. So first of all, to say that these CCDRs or Country Climate and Development Report, they are not just climate reports, they are development reports. Next slide. And so this means that when looking at climate action, we really need to, in the first place, start from basically the development challenges. And in the case of South Africa, of course, the economic challenges related to low growth over the last decade, high inequality, and of course also high levels of unemployment. So when thinking about climate action and designing climate action, this is of course meant to address these development challenges in the case of South Africa. Next slide. But of course, South Africa deals with several climate challenges. One of the most carbon intense countries in the world, of course, a high coal dependence, but all of this in a context of basically where a world is decarbonizing and where South Africa has a long way to go and very important for its competitiveness. And then, of course, the energy crisis and load shedding costs, which are estimated by some estimates to over $200 million per year. Next slide. But of course, there is adaptation challenges, and when droughts, we remember, of course, the context of the Cape Town net zero, the drought context, but at the same time also challenges related to increasing heat waves and flood risks, in particular in urban centers, in urban contexts. Next slide. So the CCDR, the country climate and development reports, is looking at these three challenges and really addressing the three challenges through three interconnected transitions: the low carbon path, the adaptation and resilient path, and the just transition, which is very important, in particular in the context of the high inequality and unemployment. Next slide. So the first message of the CCDR relates to the low carbon path. And the first message here is, while South Africa's climate transition will contribute to the global climate agenda, it is in the first place in the country's self-interest to move from coal and to go to the renewable energy path. So it's in the country's self-interest to implement mitigation and adaptation measures with a sense of urgency. Next slide. So the CCDR is looking at a low carbon development path for South Africa. And here you see this low carbon development path up to 2050. And of course, the measures that are required to reach this low carbon development path, a lot of them refer to power in the power sector in the dark blue on your screen, but other sectors of the economy as well, whether they relate to transport, waste, and others. Next slide. Now, in order to make this happen, the message of the CCDR is that investing in renewable energy is in the national best interest. It is the least cost, and it is the fastest option to expand this generation capacity and to address the electricity demand. Now, of course, this is not easy, and moving away from coal will require significant investments in renewable energy, but also in the grid and in terms of energy efficiency. Next slide. Now, when it comes to the macroeconomic implications, the report, the CCDR, an important message is that exactly lowering these emissions can actually boost the GDP growth to about 2.3% per year between 2022 and 2050, and really help address several of these development challenges that I mentioned before. At the same time, we are very clear about this is not the whole story, and it cannot replace the growth enhancing structural reforms, as mentioned before, to deal with job generation among others. Next slide. Now, the second message is very important because it relates to the previous message about the opportunity of the climate transition, but at the same time, it will also significantly affect the labor market. So the next slides will show you some interesting data about the labor market. Next slide. And the first graph that you see here is about the labor market adjustment during the law transition, where you see the gains and losses in the labor market in key economic sectors, where we see there will be losses in the labor market, for example, when it comes to coal, but at the same time also gains in labor markets, such as, for example, in electricity. And while the net gains are positive, at the same time, there is several challenges associated here. One is related to the timing challenge. Many jobs may be removed before others will be created. There is a location challenges in the sense that jobs may not be created in the same location that those that are removed from the labor market. And then, of course, there is a skill challenge where basically many jobs will require new sets of skills and reskilling. So it is triple challenges, and I'll get back to that. Next slide. Now, there is a specific focus that the CCDR is giving for the Mpumalanga province, which concentrates about 80% of the coal assets, of the coal-related activities in the countries. And a recommendation from the CCDR, from the Country Climate and Development Report, is actually to develop a roadmap, particularly for Mpumalanga, that should include temporary financial assistance to the affected workers, to scale up labor policies and labor programs, and also to provide targeted support to informal and small enterprises. Next slide, please. The third message is about the fact that climate risks will affect all citizens, but disproportionately will affect the poorest provinces, and that they must be at the center of this transition. Next slide. And here the CCDR focuses on basically on the different provinces and below province, and really highlights the fact that the poorest regions are facing the greater risks and the greater vulnerability to climate shocks. Here, the CCDR provides some priorities for action, as investing in improved weather forecasts, weather risk forecasting and early warning systems, prioritize investments in resilient infrastructure towards droughts and floods and social services, develop an insurance market for climate risks, but also improve the adaptiveness of the social assistance system, so that the people who are most vulnerable towards shocks basically get the required social assistance to recover from those shocks. Next slide, please. Finally, the Country Climate and Development Report provides also recommendations in terms of adaptation measures in key sectors like water, agriculture, cities, transport. I won't go into the details of each of the recommendation, but very important is also the integration and the coordination among those measures. For example, water and agriculture are very often very much connected. Next slide, please. Now, the last part of the South Africa CCDR relates to how to make it happen. And I will mention here two main messages that relates, on the one hand, to the financing, and on the other hand, to institutions. Next slide. So the first question is, how much will it cost and what are the financing options? And here, the total financing needs are projected at about 4.4% of the South Africa GDP between 2022 and 2050. Now, how does this compare? Next slide, please. Now, how does this compare to other countries? And these are the data from the Country Climate and Development Reports of other countries, where basically you see that South Africa is not an outlier in the overall set of countries. But when you compare it to, for example, China, you see that in the case of South Africa, there is really a savings challenge that in terms of savings available for making this transition happen. Next slide, please. So what are the recommendations that the CCDR provides in terms of the financing? One is to encourage domestic private investment to shoulder the three transitions. And this relates to enabling environment policies, regulations, pricing. Secondly, increasing public financing for the just transition and for the collective investments required by the low carbon and resilient transitions. And finally, the CCDR provides large emphasis on basically resources from multilateral and bilateral development partners, but especially on grants and concessional loans. And here the message is not only because of affordability, but because climate change is global public good, and this is a shared responsibility as climate risks are a global challenge. Next slide, please. Finally, on the institutions part and on the institutional priorities for effective implementation, they relate to several areas. First is related to the SOEs, and several SOEs have an important role to play in this targets of emission reduction. So strengthening the SOE governance, implementing the climate change bill, improving coordination, strengthening capacity, and increasing participation to make sure that there is a national consensus to basically achieve South Africa's low carbon targets. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think what's important about this particular study is that for the first time, we have a view of three buckets of costs. We have the mitigation costs, which we talk about a lot, and then we also have adaptation and just transition costs that we maybe don't talk about enough. So it's important to bear in mind, though, even today, we'll be focusing more on the mitigation, energy mix, energy choice side. Those other components are really critical in the transition. And we will talk a little bit about some of those just transition components. And I want to pick up on a couple of things. This point about household savings is kind of key because it means there's less capital liquidity in the market. And so how we fund this transition is quite difficult, particularly in the context of the just transition, where we're wanting to drive ownership and transition ownership to people who don't have capital. And so that I think is an important part of the discussion that we can pick up again a little bit later. And then to just talk a little bit about the energy modeling and the energy mix that came out in the modeling. So most of the South African net zero models, pretty much all of them, basically build lots of renewables, some storage, and then gas or some other peaking technology for particularly interseasonal peaking. So batteries are fine for sort of inter-day, inter-week peaking, but you need this kind of longer term peaking, ramping technology, and almost universally they select gas because that's the known technology today. So that's important to bear in mind. All that really changes in those net zero models is your ambition. And so if a model has greater ambition, then it builds those things earlier. And so you see earlier investments in the grid, you see earlier investments in batteries in particular. And so Systemic did a study with Stellenbosch University, and there we see a much lower carbon budget allocated to the power sector, and you get early investment in batteries, whereas the other studies, the MBI study and the UCT study, they build batteries post 2030. Because they have a higher budget allocated to the power sector. And so that's also important to bear in mind. The systems themselves don't really change. It's the timing of those systems. And those are in net zero narratives. There are other narratives that occur in South Africa where you have much later coal closure dates, you have much more emphasis on gas, and we mentioned the kind of logic behind those. But of course, all of this exists in a global context, and we need to sort of consider what's happening to global supply and demand. And so we are very lucky to have Tim here today, who's going to share with us some of the outlooks from the World Energy Outlook and other work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Steve. And it's a great pleasure to join you. I'm going to talk through, as Steve said, some of the things that we've been working on at the International Energy Agency on our World Energy Outlook, which gives our sense of today's policy realities on the one side, but also the normative aspects of looking to the future. So what would it take for us to hit a 1.5 degree stabilization? And alternatively, what if we were to hit all of our government net zero pledges, so the country pledges, on time and in full? How far would that take us towards a 1.5 degree stabilization, and what would that then mean for the energy system? And the first element that I wanted to pick up on is this idea that things are changing. The first slide that I wanted to highlight was that we've been spending roughly $1 trillion each year on energy transitions worldwide, and that includes clean energy technology investment, but also infrastructure. We are, as a result of today's crisis, in part, governments are doubling down on support for those technologies, and they become much more competitive at today's fuel prices. And so by 2030, we think that 1 trillion turns into 2 trillion. And that has some quite interesting implications then for the energy system, because what we believe to be the case is that today's uptick in coal, which is observed in many countries and regions worldwide, turns out to be relatively small and turns out to be temporary, while the increase in renewables is large and lasting. And so by 2030, renewable generation worldwide is about 90% higher than it was today. Low emission sources of generation, so renewables plus nuclear, are already greater than fossil fuels. And that produces that peak in power sector CO2 emissions that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Remember, that is all today's policy settings. So that is the stuff that's kind of built into our reading of the measures that have been taken already by governments. Now, it doesn't get us to where we need to be, but we'll come back to that in a second. The other piece of analysis that we released literally a couple of hours ago looks specifically at coal. And what we try to do there is think through what it would take to really reduce coal-related emissions in different parts of the world. And there we were really much more hinging on the more aspirational targets, so the net zero targets of individual countries. But if we move on to the next slide, I mean, a starting point for that discussion is a recognition of coal doesn't just produce generation, doesn't just generate electricity. It also provides other system services that also need to be replaced as you think about phasing down coal. And so if we can just nip back one to the previous slide. Yes. So if this is normalized to, a level of 1 in 2021, you see coal generation in a scenario in which countries hit their climate targets goes down quite quickly, and it's replaced by the components that you see there on the left-hand pie. So it's 75% is wind and solar PV, and then there's a sort of compendium of other technologies. But in there too are some things like carbon capture, utilization and storage, and co-firing with ammonia or sort of hydrogen-rich fuels, which obviously is an option for existing coal-fired capacity. But when it comes to replacing the capacity and system services that coal provides, then the first thing to note is that capacity line doesn't go down at the same speed as the generation line, because some existing coal plants are repurposed to provide balancing services. So they run much less, but they are there to accompany that large increase in solar PV and wind. And that obviously also affects the amount of new gas that you need in any of these systems. But the majority of those services are then provided by the pie on the right-hand side. So battery storage, obviously that's country contingent, but in aggregate, it plays an extremely important role. The next slide talks through some of the country specificities. And I don't need to say too much about this here because you're exceptionally well versed on, of course, the context in South Africa. What we tried to do was sort of map out the different dependencies that there are in different countries on coal. So there's indicators for economic dependence, indications for how important coal is in a domestic energy system. So I mean, Colombia, to take an interesting example, is economically quite dependent because coal is a big export, but coal is not actually a large part of the domestic energy system. So it scores relatively scores relatively low on the energy dependence side. And the heavyweights, in a sense, are all marked in red here. And it's no surprise that South Africa finds itself amongst that group. And it's no also surprise that these are the countries for which the international community is talking about these just energy transition partnerships. Because as was mentioned already, the coal value chain is just much more labor intensive than other value chains. So you have to have a sort of very integrated approach to managing the various impacts or the various effects of moving away from coal. My next slide will take us into another aspect of transitions, and that's in relation to natural gas. Because our views on natural gas change as a result of today's energy crisis. About 10 years ago, we did some analysis asking, are we entering a golden age of gas? And now those quite bullish projections for natural gas demand in the 2010s were actually quite close to where we ended up. But our view is that that was it. If there was a golden age, that was the 2010s. And the policies that are now in place in advanced economies and the price disadvantages that gas now faces in many emerging and developing economies means that growth in gas that we've seen over the last 10 years under today's policy settings, again, it really flattens out. Now, there's different stories between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies. And there are downside risks to that scenario if indeed policies accelerate, we move faster towards a 1.5 degree stabilization. But I think that's an important a point to have in mind when we discuss the future of natural gas in different energy systems. And if we put that outlook for natural gas into a sort of composite picture of where we think fossil fuel demand goes, which is on the next slide, then you'll see we're on the cusp of quite an important moment in energy history, because that flattening of natural gas, the declines in coal, and also a flattening in the 2030s in oil demand, that's enough to generate quite a distinct peak in overall fossil fuel demand. Now, fossil fuel demand has risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and fossil fuel emissions have risen every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So for us, this is actually, you know, a moment in energy history that we need to have in mind. Again, it's not enough, but it shows that the things that policymakers are talking about today and the things that industries are doing is actually already generating some quite substantial implications for the energy system. I'm going to just wrap up now with one slide on energy security, because I think that's a pivotal part of the conversation. And if we click through, because there's different elements here, if we want to get to a 1.5 degree stabilization, we need to be putting not $2 trillion into clean energy transitions by 2030, but something closer to 4 trillion. And the other thing to mention is that the amount we put into those transitions then determines how much we need to put into fossil fuels in order to avoid price volatility. So there's a contingency there, which is extremely important for policymakers to have in mind. And the other crucial element for us to have in mind also as we think about scaling up investment is that it's more challenging to put together all sorts of projects, but particularly clean energy projects in many emerging and developing economies, because the cost of capital, the perceived or real risks associated with those investments are that much higher. And in a world where borrowing costs are rising, that is a really significant thing for us to have in mind as we talk about the pace of transitions. And finally, as we move from a moment in energy history where our thinking is dominated by sort of a gas crisis, let's not swap one vulnerability for another. Let's make sure that we work hard on the resilience of our clean energy supply chains. And because many of the components that we need for the clean energy technologies that we need to rely on in future, those supply chains are significantly more concentrated geographically than our existing supply chains for oil, gas, or coal. Now, there's big opportunities there for Africa. There's big opportunities there for South Africa. I saw the numbers you had for platinum in your presentation. But that's something that policymakers are increasingly focused on around the world. I did say that was my final slide. I remembered I got one more, but this rounds it up for energy-related emissions. So perhaps we can go through that last one. So we have a peak in fossil fuel demand in our today's policy settings. That's enough to get us off a rising trajectory that we had as our baseline before the Paris Agreement to something that's a 10% reduction by 2050. So that gets us from a 3.5 degree expectation for the rise in global average temperatures in 2100 to a 2.5 degree. Now, the big question is, can that 2.5 become 1.5? If all of the country net zero pledges are implemented, then we get down to something close to 1.7 in our view. But of course, that's a big if. And there's still some way to go before we get to that net zero emissions trajectory by 2050, which gives us a reasonable chance then of a 1.5 degree stabilization. I'm sorry, I've probably gone over time, but hopefully there was things in there for you.
Hi, okay, perfect. Maybe a couple of follow-up questions before I move to the panel. In your analysis, how much regional variation there is there? So we kind of think in South Africa that it's, as I say, renewables with some battery storage, maybe some pumped hydro and gas, and that seems to be the dominant technology choice. Do you see any variation? Is that what's happening in net zero scenarios around the world?
I think it really depends a lot on country endowments. Clearly, the type of renewable technologies that come through more strongly are heavily dependent then on, the geographical location of different countries. I mean, I think Japan's an interesting example in that respect, because it doesn't have many sort of natural advantages when it comes to generating renewables at home, but a large industrial base. Therefore, in a way, it needs to focus, and it can't. There's really no scope for CCUS domestically in Japan. So, in a sense, it needs to import emissions reductions in the form of low carbon fuels, and that's why Japan has been the anchor, or is becoming the anchor for a lot of the discussions around international trade in hydrogen-rich fuels or green ammonia, because otherwise, it's difficult to see on what basis you move towards. So that pathway is quite distinctive when you compare it to the pathway of Europe or North America, or indeed other parts of the emerging world.
Okay. And then is your analysis of the South African transition similar to ours? Is there any variation there?
So I think we're broadly aligned with the sorts of things that we've heard. I think one area which perhaps we need to look at, I'd like to see the comparison side by side, is the extent to which we have other options apart from retirement for the coal fleet, because in our view, those other things, repurposing, retrofitting to a degree, but the integrating that into a view of how you keep electricity system stability through to 2050, at least temporarily, until you can scale up other options, I think is a one to look at.
Okay, that's interesting. So if I read between the lines, what you're saying is there is an option to run coal fleets on lower energy availability factors and utilizations that sort of provide some balancing support, but also maybe create some employment and keep some of the value chain in place.
So if you compare the IEA scenarios, like net zero scenarios, with some of the integrated assessment model work that's represented in the IPCC, so we tend to have slightly higher coal use now. And the reason for that is we try and think through very carefully the sort of political economy of moving those coal plants out of the system. There's a natural tendency for any energy model, when you're optimizing for emissions reductions, you just get rid of coal as quickly as you can. And when we looked at some of those projections, that wasn't the basis on which we felt we could reasonably go to countries and have a productive discussion about pathways and policies and social implications. So we've tried to I mean, coal still gets hammered in a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, but it's designed in a way that enables us to have those conversations. And I'm not sure you can do that with all of the pathways that are out there.
Okay, but to be clear, on the existing policy scenarios, we are seeing a peaking in fossil fuels across all of the fuels. It includes coal, but there is some opportunity, particularly in this coal discussion, that you might sort of delay the transition. I don't know if delay is the right word, but manage that transition so that you have some of this peaking capability built into coal.
Yeah, I wouldn't overstate that. You still need to see a dramatic reduction in coal
Yeah.
emissions and coal use. But I think the way that we put that modeling together is that we need to make sure that when we talk to governments, they have confidence that we are paying enough attention to electricity security, that we have enough sort of redundancy in the system that allows us to make sure that we can ride the bumps that inevitably will come along as you move through a rapid transition.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. If I can ask my panel to return. Yeah, big round of applause. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe to kind of point out, so the CCDR report, and unfortunately Owen had to leave for another engagement, but that CCDR report actually runs the coal fleet on 20% utilization for quite a period into the sort of early 2040s, and for the same kind of logic that you espouse. And I wonder if I can turn to you, Andre, just to give us a view on Eskom's thinking about that. Is that something you're looking at? And how are you thinking about the differences between these optimal pathways and what the real world looks like? Does that change the way Eskom thinks about these things?
Thanks. I think there's remarkable consistency between what was presented and how we see the world. It may be because we use the same modeling tools that spits out the same answers. But we have as a target net zero by 2050 as a utility. We also have our last remaining coal-fired power stations reaching end of economic life by 2069 and 2071 respectively. But that is premised on the assumption that there is no alternative technology available that will supersede it. And it's also premised on the assumption that there will be no punitive carbon tax or emission requirement that forces us to shut that down prematurely. We can only do our modeling on what we know right now. So up until 2035, we will be shutting down 22 gigawatts of capacity. That's about 47% of our total installed capacity. That removes close to 50% of our emissions. So that's already a huge move in a relatively short space of time. And for those of you who've been keeping tabs on our system presentation that was presented today, this is a matter of fact where the coal fleet starts to retire itself. Mechanical equipment has a finite life. You cannot keep on extending it indefinitely. You don't see many 50-year-old cars on the road, nor will you see many 50-year-old power plants continuing to operate at high utilization rates.
Thanks. So Joanne, maybe you've been kind of in the thick of the debates around energy planning for the last couple of months. What are the kind of counter narratives that you're hearing? I mean, we have a strong sense of what this net zero pathway looks like, but what are other opinions in this space? It'd be interesting to get your thoughts, and I'll ask the other panelists more or less the same question.
Okay, Steve, if I'm hearing you correctly, I think that the biggest issue that is raised, and I think it's very common in South Africa, is this issue that you need fossil baseload for a secure and stable energy system. And I think that it is a critical conversation where there needs to be, I suppose, a much more evidence-based and informed discussion that takes place in order that you can start to build consensus around what is actually possible. But I think that until we address that question of do you or don't you need baseload and in what form? And does it have to be fossil fuel baseload? And do technologies like the storage technologies that are developing, can they serve that function? Can gas serve the function of system balancing and stability? There's definitely a conversation that we have to have around that. So that's the one that I hear most commonly.
I think Andre wanted to comment on that, which
Sorry to hog the mic, but the notion of baseload, I think, is premised on some pretty antiquated thinking. Our power system was designed in the 1970s and 1980s for an economy that looked completely different to what we've got today. It had a very large mining sector. In 1994, for example, manufacturing was 27% of GDP. Today, it is less than 13%. Our domestic sector has changed due to electrification to the extent where we have far peakier peaks than the system was designed for. And our coal plants are just not sufficiently flexible. So in the 6 months from April of this year, we've already had to curtail wind generation 55 times. So that means that we had excess generation that if we had storage, we could have captured it, but we had to shed production even as we shed load during peak periods. So I think we need to get away from this thinking that baseload is a holy cow, and we need to look at the realities of the demands of our economy and address that. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Perfect. And that requires thinking about energy differently. So we're thinking about systems that are inverter based, where the primary challenge is dealing with that peaking of power demand at key points in the day. And that requires different kinds of technologies. And the point you made earlier is there's a range of things that we have to provide in the energy system. And we're going to use different technology to provide those different services. So peaking will be from one technology, energy power will be from another. We have to think about frequency management. And so the combination of energy technologies will provide all of these services, and from all modeled accounts, cheaper than this traditional idea of what a baseload system looks like. So maybe Hlengiwe, what are the kinds of things that you worry about in this energy transition and the things that maybe the youth are thinking about?
For us, in terms of like what you are worried about, I guess, is 50 years from now, are we going to be left with the coal power stations that are inefficient? Are we going to be energy secure? Energy security is a very important. So we're worried about that. Is our country going to be left behind, and load shedding will become something that we experience every day? And I think even further than that is are we going to experience a total shutdown of as well? And will we have enough skills in the country to, once we have that shutdown, will you have enough skills to actually get our grid up again? So I think those are some of the worries. But just to also answer some of the questions that you asked, Joanne, is I think that the other narrative for people who aren't in the energy space is, why are we transitioning? Like a lot of people are saying, why leave out coal when we have it in the country? It's a resource we have. Why are we then moving to renewables? They see that the other day I was at a youth conference, and one of the questions was that BMW didn't get this peak because of renewable energies. It needed coal to be able to industrialize. Your European countries needed to get coal to be able to have your BMWs, your all these large economies. So they are saying, why then should we do that? Why should we not follow the same path that they did? So those narratives are still out there, and we need to really engage with them, especially for people who are outside these discussions in the room as well. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. Some important inputs there. I think and we hear this a lot, right? Why are we transitioning? Africa only produces 4% of global emissions. Therefore, we should have much more space to expand. And so we hear that leading to narratives around, well, shouldn't we be developing our offshore resource to access this massively burgeoning market? Of course, the question is that market burgeoning? We're actually seeing that marketing come down. And so that changes the kind of dynamics, and we'll maybe pick that up a little bit more. James, your thought on sort of counter narratives, but I mean, I know you've also only been in the job for 3 months, but what is your thinking about how this planning is rolling out, what kind of energy systems we should be targeting?
Thanks, Steve. And I think your point now kind of really comes into it. So let me try and also be a little bit controversial and oversimplify the problem, if you don't mind.
No, well, people would be interested in controversy. Go for it.
So I think that there's a lot of expectations that this energy transition is like a zipper, and it's all just going to come together nicely over time. And we're focusing on a 2050 end game. I don't think we don't have that time. We probably only have till 2030 to get our plans in place and make sure that we're actually ready and know what we're doing. And so there's two reasons why I say that. So one is, as a very energy intensive economy, we actually have to move a lot quicker than a lot of counterparties. The other thing is, if I talk to my members, and that's from pulp and paper industry, alloys, automotive sector, any export exposed sector, are saying that probably at max by 2030, and we're seeing the automotive sectors a lot earlier, is going to be a pass-fail on green credentials. So ETS, CBAM, all of these things are going to be such that we love your product, great price, but actually we're just not buying from you. So this is not a sort of an aspiration around what and where we need to go to around climate change. This has become a very commercial and economic reality, and it's much closer than I think the current conversation is allowing. And maybe just one other point on this now, and then hand back, is that so we need to move really quickly. And I think that there's been fantastic work, and we've seen that the what has been well articulated. We see in private sector pockets of excellence, fantastic kind of projects, pilot projects which can compete on the global stage. We now need to move on, because the pathways to scale is what's going to give us the speed. And the pathway to scale is always going to it's going to follow an S-curve, standard S-curve. And we're in this bottom kind of flat period. If we can't work out how to accelerate and bring forward the knee point, move into scale, which means it must be commercial, and there's a whole lot of other things we need to do there around implementation, making really hard decisions, bringing government, bringing other entities into that. But that S-curve knee point, if we can't bring that forward, we will have market failures, and we will lose portions of our economy because we're just not moving quick enough as it stands. So I really hope that we can focus on what needs to be done in standing up the new energy world that we're going to live in, and what does that clean tech look like. Then we can come back and say, how do we blend and make sure that we have a reliable energy system that covers the transition? But I think we've got to now move the narrative. We've got to start looking forward, and we've done all the good work and the hard work around articulating the what. Everyone's on board. We very much agreed, so I think we've got to move now.
Well, I mean, maybe I can just stick with you for a second, and I'll come back to Andre on the same point. So one version of that narrative we hear is, because we have all these problems, right? We have load shedding, we need to accelerate our transition. We can't do that with renewables, and there are other options. We should be diversifying the mix and focusing on other technologies. How do you see that? I mean, do you see exclusive focus on renewables? Do you see this broader diversification? How do you feel about that?
Well, again, I think it's that S-curve concept. So if we say we need a certain form of energy, and we've taken a very much a technology aspect. So if we want to take coal, let's see. And I think to Andre's point, can you build coal in the timeframes required? Does coal have technology and innovation that will make it suitable and sustainable in a future variable, decentralized, highly digitized energy world? Is it in line with climate change punitive measures? Not save the planet climate change, but kind of CBAM, ETS, these sort of things. So if you had to go to any of our industrial sectors and say, will you support coal? They'll go, no ways. I will just go and build my own stuff. Otherwise, actually, I'm out of this economy. So when you start creating a framework around decisions, I think it becomes a lot easier to pick what type of technologies, but we're a little bit caught in the past of, you know, guns loaded. Is it gas? Is it nuclear? Is it coal? You know, and these technology debates is not really the challenge that we face. We've got to build, we've got to get to the knee curve, which means we need to think about our EPC and construction capabilities, our supply chains, our value chain in around local content, because that is what we need to create scale. So we've got to bring that closer, and we've got to move that conversation and get away from the technology arguments per se.
Well, while you pass the mic along, I think that's a really interesting point about domestic demand, right? And what we're saying is that the energy users want this renewable energy because that makes them more competitive on international markets and potentially also provides a cheaper input cost. From a supply side point of view, Andrea, I mean, are you seeing the same thing? How do you think about this need to accelerate? Does this mean we build more coal and gas, or how would you think of that as a planner?
Yeah, I think if you just look at the realities of our major industrial customers, we export as a country about 85 to 88% of the vehicles that are manufactured in South Africa. If we do not decarbonize, we will lose those markets. We will lose the manufacturing jobs. And we can complain about the injustice of it all. It's a fact. It's going to happen. If I talk to the chief executives of some very large manufacturers in South Africa, they say, please get me green energy. I was having a chat to a representative earlier on of a large smelter, and this colleague was saying he's just lost key markets because of the attributed carbon footprint based on Eskom's carbon footprint, and he can no longer export his particular commodity to international markets because of these market forces, never mind regulation. So I think the notion that because you have a resource, you've got to use it until it's extinguished, I think that is not something that resonates with me, because the Stone Age didn't end because of a lack of stones. Technology advances, technology moves on, and you've got to move with technology trends. And if we want to protect our economy and our competitiveness as an export country, 46% of our exports are susceptible to carbon border taxes. That is an existential threat. If we don't decarbonize, we will start having to do business with ourselves or with Zimbabwe. I don't know, but our major export markets will no longer be able to accept our products. And I think we've got to face up to that reality as an imperative to decarbonize. So I completely agree with James. This is not an option. Even if you are environmentally agnostic, the terms of trade are going to be such that you have to move with them.
And from a generation perspective, are you finding that renewables are the generation of choice, or do you still have some debate about?
Yeah, I think what is very difficult to solve is to maintain 50 hertz 24/7 with renewables. So we've got to look at alternative technology, synchronous condensers, batteries. We are great fans of pumped hydro storage because it's scalable. From a total cost of ownership perspective, it beats, in our view, batteries hands down, and it is green and very low maintenance once it's built. So you've got to design a system that accommodates the generation technologies that are going to be acceptable going forward. We see a role for some peaking. So with other words, probably natural gas with relatively low utilization rates to tide you over. But we also see an abundant resource in South Africa from solar and wind resources that we can capitalize on, and that cannot be exported to China to be beneficiated there and then resold to us.
James? Do you want to say something as well, Joanne?
Steve, just a quick comment on that. We've got to be careful of trying to boil the ocean and working out where we're going to be in 2050 as an energy sector. The reality is we're at the beginning of the transition, and as a country, as South Africa, we are still a 90%, let's call it, centralized fossil fuel driven energy sector. As we get deeper into this transition, we're going to see the entire system has to change. So, we've got to think about a system way of an energy transition and not an asset replacement like for like. It will start out like that, where we're going to replace. But actually, and the minister said it this morning, it's a complete systemic change. It's a change in the way we behave and work and live in the future.
Yes, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you both, and Joanne, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, is the solution for the short-term problem and the long-term problem are fundamentally the same thing. Our initial focus is rolling out renewables. Joanne.
Yeah, I think there is a question though about how we roll out renewables and for whom. And so bringing the issues around justice and access, I think, into this conversation are critical. And I think it's a drum I keep on beating. If we don't think about those distributional issues and about access, we're going to sit in a country where the rich in industry have power and the poor have none. And I think that would destroy a transition. So I think the question of what are the forms of ownership, how do we put in place the programs that are going to allow for poor communities to generate their own power, to support, to be supported in rolling out renewables across the country in a wall-to-wall way. It is one of the important things that we've got to start to build into the conversation. And Andre, I hope you're going to talk about your mini grids, because I think that's a great example of how you start to look at benefit spreading. But I think we mustn't lose it in this conversation, because if we do, we're looking at something very posh.
I mean, before you respond there, Andre, I'd also be interested in your views on pricing. And so, I mean, in this context, we hear a lot that we need a bigger provision of free energy to the poor than we have now. But of course, that puts pricing pressure on the whole system, and some kind of potentially stepped pricing where, if you use a heavy, especially as a household level, if you're a heavy energy user, you're paying quite a lot for that power.
Yeah, just to respond to Joanne's comments, I think we shouldn't idealize the status quo. What is currently happening with coal-fired generation is that we have significant energy poverty in South Africa. We have 29,000 was the correct statistics, premature deaths every year because of ambient air pollution, which is largely attributable to energy poverty, people burning paraffin, coal for cooking, space heating, and lighting. Now that is an unacceptable situation and has got to be addressed. So I think we have this tendency to say, if we move to a new energy system, we will exacerbate energy poverty. And in fact, I think it creates opportunities for us to address the current unacceptable situation. But your point's well made. We have to bear that in mind. In response to the question on pricing, I think we've got to first of all ensure that tariffs are cost reflective. The notion that you can have non-cost reflective tariffs and have sustainable investments, it doesn't work. The gravity of finance will reassert itself, and you will have an electricity utility that is so indebted that it cannot service its debts without borrowing more, which is exactly where we are right now. So I think we need cost reflective tariffs. We also need to develop feed-in tariffs that allow those with rooftop solar or excess electricity generation to feed it back into the grid. That is not yet in place except in certain select municipalities. So that, I think, is an easy win to incentivize new rooftop solar generation. Then when you look at the so-called inclined block system, which penalizes you the more you use, what we figured out is that it's actually creating perverse incentives to accelerate grid defection to the point where the rich who can afford it go off grid, and they deprive Eskom, in our case, of revenue while still relying on the grid to act as a backup. So a big virtual battery, which we have to pay to maintain, and that can be tapped into at a moment's notice. So while the notion of punishing the heavy user makes some intuitive sense, when you look at the behavior that it incentivizes, it actually achieves the opposite.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Hlengiwe, returning to you into this topic of just transition. I mean, what are the things that you think we should be thinking about in this energy transition that involve people?
Yeah, so I think something that comes to mind is energy efficiency. Like some of the lowest hanging fruits of how to transition is before we even start to say, let's put in renewables on the grid. Let's start by being efficient at our homes. Let's start being efficient in our businesses and our buildings. Our transport sector needs to be more efficient. So we need to encourage behavior within our people to say, build better homes that do not consume so much, not only because it will reduce the energy needed for us to put up more solar panels, but also it's for environmental benefits. It reduces the emissions that are required. It also as well for your home, you are saving as well. We need to encourage that with businesses as well, to say they are because we can't say we're transitioning yet we are still wasting energy. Part of our transition is that we must conserve and must be efficient in what we put up. We must reduce our demand for energy, because that also means less debt that we are getting to invest as well, because we're requiring less energy demand as people as well. Yeah.
I think it's a very powerful point, and it's actually something that bothers me quite a lot. So if we look at all of these net zero models, there's a huge chunk of it that's allocated to energy efficiency, but we see very little investment in energy efficiency. And I know that Joanne and the MBI team have tried for years to develop energy efficiency finance products, and it kind of always fails at the sort of last hurdle. So I think this is something we do need to very, very carefully think about. Andre.
You know, there's a very simple answer to that. Just raise the price of electricity. It encourages efficiency enormously.
Yeah, but perhaps not for the poor. And then we find ourselves in a vicious cycle. So I want to just touch a little bit on this idea of gas and gas demand, and I'm actually going to bring Tim back in here. So I think what we've established here is that there is very little domestic demand for gas in power, right? But there might be some demand for domestic gas in industrials, particularly with Sasol and with iron and steel. And I guess there's a question about whether that level of gas demand justifies offshore gas investments. And I would suggest no, but I'm going to ask you to think about that a little bit, James. And then the question as well, is there enough global demand for our investment in domestic gas in South Africa and Africa as a whole? So I'd be interested in your thoughts, Tim, on what you're finding in your models around gas and the role of gas, particularly in Africa. We hear that narrative a lot. Africa should be allowed to exploit its gas resources. It's a big source of income and employment. Will that market be there? What kind of conditions would you think about that would make that gas investment competitive?
It's a tricky question, but I think I say a couple of things on the demand side. Indeed, very much agree that the conversation about gas in Africa has to be one around domestic utilization for industrialization, urbanization, the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built, the rise in the urban population, the volume of energy intensive products that will be required in order to build up that infrastructure. For the reasons that have been talked about, there is a gap there for industrial use that can be usefully filled by gas, pending, the availability of all sorts of other industrial technologies that, may be able to do the same job. But we don't have high temperature heat pumps. We don't have hydrogen-based steel manufacture, that's competitive with traditional. So I think, that is an important part of the conversation. And Africa is, of course, quite a gas-rich continent. Where I would be more careful is that these upstream developments, they need to be they don't just need to be low cost. They need to be sort of impeccable in the way that they are managed. And they also require investment in some fairly long-lived infrastructure. And so, one of the issues that is very visible now in Europe, because Europe is trying to solve a near-term problem with recourse to discussions with a long-term industry. And there's this sort of mismatch in temporal expectations where, Europe is saying, well, we need gas for 5 or 10 years. And then the gas suppliers are saying, well, I'm sorry, there's nothing for us to talk about, because if you want to underpin new gas developments, we have to be talking 2025. And that sort of goes too far down into Europe's own horizons for decarbonisation. And so you end up with quite an unproductive conversation. So those are some of the things I think are in play.
So maybe just a follow on, if I think this through. So your step scenario, your existing policy scenario is a general decline in gas demand, although there might be a short-term peaking interest. And so if we were developing a gas resource, we would need to get it to market pretty quickly, both to capture some of this initial demand, but also because these long-lived assets have to be kind of shut down 2050-ish. But also we would have to be in the best half of the cost producers in order to be competitive in this market where there's a stable supply and a declining demand. Is that a fair assessment?
So in all of our scenarios, you do have, gas demand in Africa increases until, sometime well into the 2030s, primarily for the reasons I've talked about. So there is an upswing in domestic use, provided that the conditions are in place for sort of reasonably robust economic growth. But then, gas does start to get squeezed, and so that's where the sort of question marks come in about putting a big bet down on gas in the near term, because you're never quite sure about the longevity of that demand relative to the perspectives that you need to really justify the use of to justify the investment in some quite capital intensive infrastructure.
Thanks. Joanne?
Steve, can I comment on this issue in Africa, but from a very different perspective? In fact, two of them. I think the first thing is that I think that we have failed miserably in making the relationship between increasing emissions and physical climate risk clear. And I think until that connection is made in a very fundamental way by governments, it's all very well saying, well, you used gas and we didn't, and now we want to, until you start to say, but if we do, these are the potential consequences, or this is what it's going to mean in terms of the global emissions and the global carbon budget and the physical climate risk and the worsening physical climate risk. So I think there's a real conversation to be had around how these things all get linked together. And then in an African context, you say, well, what does that really mean and what are the alternatives? I think the second thing is an issue around climate finance, which is there's a lot of very loose talk about African countries leapfrogging a fossil fuel energy system. But in reality, no one is funding, supporting, putting in place the systems, the financing mechanisms, the ways to do that, particularly in the least developed countries in Africa where the energy poverty is the worst. So I think that, you know, it's all very well saying that kind of there's no logic around seeing gas as a wonderful future, and that is correct. But I think that there are these two other issues which we really do need to confront and address if one wants to move beyond this idea, well, the West use fossil fuels, so why can't we? I think they're real challenges that we have to manage.
Yeah, that's interesting. Andre unfortunately has to leave us. If we can give him a round of applause and thank him for his contribution. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And one of the reasons we kicked off with the CCDR is to just keep reminding us that this investment is happening in an adaptation context. Your point about we're not valuing the climate impact enough, or costing it rather, and the same around social costs. So we're not really thinking these through when we think about mitigation, and they're really important parts of the conversation, actually. James, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'll go back to my earlier point that I think we've got to move away from the historic structured thinking, and we've got to start thinking in the future. So a gas, no gas conversation is actually irrelevant to the problem that we're trying to solve, because we're trying to solve a system transition over a period of time, whereas gas is actually a supply side technology. So certainly as a council, you know, we kind of found these technology silos when I arrived, and what I've tried to do is kind of restructure the sort of approach and the narrative to saying that it has to be market led, because the market is going to change, and that's what we need to understand. So yes, there's a supply side conversation, but there's also demand side, ESCO's efficiencies. We then need to think about all the services and the connections, the grids, the pipelines, the ports, the utilities. We then need to go to the market and say, well, what's happening in the emissions, the taxes, the ISMO, the trading. So it takes all of those things to work in unison to create the energy transition. So when one pitches up and says, do we need gas or no gas? It's irrelevant. I mean, you know, we're saying, how does gas, no gas fit into the speed at which we need to move and the pressure we're under, the technology and innovation and learning curves that are coming at us? The ability to finance, and that's access finance, then affordability and bankability. And then to Joanne's point, and what is the societal impact of that? And then where does that gas, no gas conversation with those risk flags fit into that market-led view that says it's got to be sustainable over 20 to 30 years? Then you can turn around and say, well, now we know where the role of gas is in the transition and in these sectors and in a market-led view. So I mean, that's certainly the way that we're trying to position it, because, you know, this gas, having a gas sort of technology work stream, again, it's like the Christmas's vote, turkey's voting for Christmas. They're all going to say, we need big gas because we need base load and we need this and we need that. And it's really just not true. We've got to change the thinking, and we've got to be kind of thinking about the future, not about what's happened in the past.
Okay.
Thanks.
But gas or no gas? No, I'm playing. So, but would you apply similar logic to nuclear, right? So that's another narrative we hear, that you need nuclear for base load, and then there's a separate discussion around sort of SMR for peaking. Do you have any thoughts on that? Same logic?
I mean, to me, it fits perfectly. So the first question is speed. So big nuclear, 14 years to build. It's already out. It can be something in the future, but going back to the earlier conversation, if we need decisions around preserving our industries and making sure we don't have a big deindustrialization market failure, we actually need decisions now in the next 3 to 5 years. So nuclear doesn't make it for speed. If one switches to the technology innovation, if we saw small modular reactors that could be cheaper, more affordable, more dispersed, decentralized, absolutely, we're in the game. Now we can bring that back into the mix and say, where does that type of technology around nuclear fit? You could even bring coal. So if we could say, fantastic idea, we're going to run out of gas out of Pandit Temane from Mozambique in a couple of years' time. Why would that stranded asset not work to do a big reverse of carbon capture and storage? It could be the cheapest and best global kind of project around carbon capture. That might be what Andre needs to keep those last 2-3 coal-fired power stations running till the end of economic life, but in a sustainable way under the emissions boundaries. So the minute we start contextualizing around what is the speed, pressure, and global trade positions? What is the technology innovation? We start seeing different opportunities, and we start being able to put these things in not a supply side conversation, but a market kind of transition conversation.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm gonna ask Tim one last question, maybe your thoughts on nuclear and how you see nuclear in the global energy mix. And then I'm gonna come to everybody for a final wrap and then hand over to Crispian.
Well, I very much agree with some of the considerations that have been made now. I mean, the traditional nuclear cycle is, the lead times are a very long, and it's not obvious that those kinds of facilities fit well with the sort of electricity system that we've been discussing today. And were there to be something more modular, smaller, I mean, that's just a better fit with the kind of discussion we've been having. And I think it would be easier to insert that kind of technology into the sort of storylines and narratives that we've been kicking around today. So there's some very interesting demonstration projects taking place at the moment in Canada and the US, some in Europe too and elsewhere. In our view, for this technology, as for many others, the 2020s are the sort of testing period, and then insofar as we're going to see large-scale deployment, that's probably for the next decade.
So in case you missed the question to that last answer, I asked how far away do we think SMR is? Basically proving it now, if it works, deploy it in scale in the 2030s. Okay. So I'm going to ask each panelist just for concluding comments, 1 or 2 minutes, and then Crispin will close for us.
So I suppose my concluding comment is really around the value of a crisis. If we had a perfectly well-functioning coal-fired power system, I don't think we'd all be sitting here in the way that we are at the moment and having the conversation that we are having, particularly not with industry. So I think in a kind of perverse kind of way, the fact that we have a crumbling coal-fired power system has created an opportunity in South Africa to really reimagine how we want, what the power system we want to see, and to be able to choose a direction. And I think that is a hugely fortunate thing. I mean, all of the complexities around it, all of the implementation challenges, all of the debates that we have, I still think that we're sitting as a country that for well over 100 years has seen its future as solidly rooted in coal. The fact is that we have to think of other options. And in this climate context, I think it's a major opportunity.
I guess for me, the energy transition is happening. It's happening whether we want to participate in it or don't want to participate in it. So we have to make a conscious decision to be part of the transition, but also we have to ensure that while we are trying to balance the environmental impacts, the climate change issues, we must not forget about our people as well. We must ensure that our people aren't left behind, as the point about energy access, and will our people still be able to afford energy? Will they have energy when all the rich people have solar panels? Will they? What will happen to them? So we need to think about that. But also our economy. My first point was around we are worried about energy security. We must ensure that whatever we plan now is going to ensure our energy security so that our economy can grow, so that Africa isn't left behind, South Africa isn't left behind, and the narrative that Africa is a dark continent needs to end, and these are the discussions that we'll get it over there. And just lastly, I think what PCC is doing in terms of bringing all the voices into the discussion needs to continue happening. We really need to bring all everyone in the discussions, impacted communities, youth, businesses, to come together and discuss. We can't, as civil society, go into our corner and discuss how we're going to reduce energy emissions. That we're not the ones who are putting out emissions. We need to bring in businesses as well. We need to bring in government to say how do we put up an enabling environment. So we can't work in silos. We really need to start working together. And yes, when you say we, I mean, young people need to be in that discussion. Please do not leave us and don't let us be on the menu. We need to be part of the discussion because this is our future we're discussing. Thanks.
Maybe a quick one. If I just reflect on sort of the executive conversations that I have with my members, I don't think the executives ever turn around and say, we don't know what technology to use and we don't know, we don't have enough finance, and we don't have enough people. We're seeing amazing kind of innovation, agility, pilot projects on the ground that is coming out of the South Africa context and businesses. The primary issue is that they say, we don't have confidence and we don't have clarity of what the transition roadmap looks like. What is policy coherence going to be? What is the role of government? How do we scale up? And we have to do it very urgently. So I think it, you know, the platforms there, we've got to kind of double down, I think, on the fantastic work and the great work that's been done in South Africa to date, and take us now into the next phase of really implementing and having the next round of really hard conversations. So look forward to supporting it, Steve.
Well, I think we've been given an absolute feast this afternoon, and you can see Steve is the Climate Commission's head for energy planning and mitigation, and you can see what a brain he's got on him. So a real, you know, heads up to all of you for this debate. So, you know, clearly we're dealing with a vast amount of uncertainty. We don't really know how fast the climate constraint is going to be imposed on us. We don't really know how fast technology is going to change and innovation is going to happen in the sector. We've got big uncertainties around the institutional framework. We've seen government capacity on a downward trajectory for a decade. We all hope it's turning the corner and on the upward trajectory, but we don't even really know about that. So, you know, these are really big existential uncertainties. And it's not surprising that at this stage of the game, we have some, at times, profoundly competing narratives. So you've heard different emphases today, you know, differences about the pace at which we have to transition, real debates around the energy mix and how much gas, whether nuclear is part of the question, how fast we can pull coal off, how fast we can scale up renewables. You know, in the work that we do as the Commission, the Climate Commission, this is the material we work with. In fact, we like controversy. The more debate and the more active the debate, the more, you know, our work becomes meaningful and real. And I do think there's some very important common threads that have been woven through the conversation this afternoon. So no one's disputing that there's a profound transition underway. No one is disputing that there's an economic imperative to transition. So, you know, I think there's a collective realization that South Africa is at grave risk in terms of our economic fortunes and jobs in our country if we don't get a move on with decarbonization. And I think we're all broadly aligned around net zero. We understand we need to get to net zero by mid-century. There's some nuances around what our budget is, our carbon budget. So the World Bank report you heard earlier is actually attached to a 9 gigaton budget. The NBI pathways modeling work that they did is a 10 gigaton budget. There's a big difference between those two budgets because the 9 gigaton budget shuts Sasol down by 2035. That's the only way they get to 9 gigs. And they run the coal fleet at a 20% EAF which I didn't hear Andre's reply clearly to that. I don't think they can run the fleet at 20%. So, 9 gigatons has some very serious implications for us. 10 business says is doable. So again, this is a debate where, the country hasn't put its, I don't think government's put its head on the block about what the carbon budget is that we're working to. But, that aside, we know that we need to do renewables at a pace that is much faster than we're doing today. The figure we've got 6 to 7 gigatons of renewables each year for the next 20 years. A vast, acceleration, to use James's term, a vast acceleration in what we're doing. And combined with that, we've got to fundamentally reconfigure the energy grid in South Africa. It's configured for the coal resource. We need to reconfigure it for where the renewable resource and maybe in the longer term, the storage and hydrogen and pumped storage schemes are going to be located. So I think some very powerful common messages around which we can move. That's probably the last thing that we're all clearly agreed on. Implementation, implementation, implementation. We don't want to be planning for the next decade while the world moves from under our feet. So, we want to leave this COP and get on with the business of making this transition happen. So thank you everyone for participating and listening. Thank you to Steve for so expertly guiding us, and to the IEA for joining us, very insightful, and to our panel for your insights.